Let's go ahead and move on to Delon in California. Delon, how is it going, buddy?
Hey, what's going on, Mr. Dan? Hello, Cosmic Skeptic. What's happening?
Dude,
Hello, good to speak to you.
we're chilling. It's a cool night. It's 1 a.m. for Alex, but he's holding strong.
I know.
I'm really proud of him.
I was about to say good morning. Good morning and good evening to Dan.
Yeah, for sure. So how can we assist you today, Delon?
Yeah, so I wanted to just kind of run this by you. It's a little bit of a challenge, and it may not be. For me, this idea is not very controversial in my mind, but apparently with a lot of people that I have conversations with, it is. But I'm going to see what you guys have to say about this.
All right.
But what I'm proposing is that reality, I mean, literally, our reality is a virtual reality, literally, right?
Right.
And
so you're talking Elon Musk.
Crazy.
Elon Musk, straight up. We're all living in the simulation, right?
Nothing like that.
Okay.
That's not really what I mean.
All right.
And I think that this is where confusion can come in on that. And in fact, I use this argument to kind of plant seeds of doubts with theists, you know. Basically, what I'm saying is that our reality, what we experience as real, is not really the reality out there, quote unquote, right?
Okay.
We sort of emerge from our brains, sort of take in information, and then it's filtered and it gets plastered onto this display screen we call our consciousness, right? Okay. But it's not really the real reality. It's a virtual reality. It's a reconstruction, right?
Sure.
So what this means to me is that, you know, there's information out there which would be, I mean, fundamentally, I guess it would be fields and particles and things of that nature, photons, all of that stuff gets ingested through our sense organs, our nervous system, and we kind of construct this reality for ourselves in our minds. But where this information is kind of helpful is it kind of helps you understand that you should be very skeptical about, you know, things that you experience, right? Our brains can easily deceive us because we're already sort of in an illusion already, if all of that is true, right? And I think the science bears that out. I think science uses specialized tools and everything because we kind of know that our, you know, sixth senses or more than that are going to reinterpret and oftentimes mislead us. Right?
Yeah. I want to hear Alex's take on
yeah, I'd love to hear it
now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. The way you phrase it is interesting because when someone pipes up and says, you know, maybe reality isn't real or something, it all sounds a bit wishy-washy mumbo jumbo, but you're right in the sense that mainstream science will accept that the way that we see things, our vision, is a reconstruction of sense experience in the brain. It's not like sight is something that kind of actively happens as we think about it intuitively. We are just practically absorbing particles into our eyes. And that's just being reconstructed by our brains. I mean, we take things in upside down and it reflects them and turns it into a kind of signal that goes up to our brain. Same thing with sound. Sound is just air moving back and forth, but that's not how we experience it. So sound does not exist. The sound that you really experience when you hear a piano key or a drum being hit or something, that doesn't exist per se. It doesn't exist in the real world, as it were. It exists purely as a product of the reconstruction of sense experience by your brain. So I think that's absolutely true. The question is then, what do we do with that information? Well, this is where we kind of have to assume that everybody's doing the same thing. When you get down to a really meta level, you might say that even the photons that are causing the sense experience might not be real. Even the vibrations in the air that are causing my experience of sound might not be real. That's a whole deeper level of analysis. You get into like solipsism. What if nothing else actually exists? But this construction of the world that you're talking about, the idea that something does actually exist, but it's just that our brains are kind of translating it almost. It's like everything is in a different cosmic language, and we're just trying to understand it all together, and we all speak that same language. In that situation, it's not really a massive problem because every single thing that you do in your life, every single piece of knowledge you have that isn't a priori, this is something David Hume pointed out, every single part of it is based on experience. Everything you know. And so if we are confined to experiencing the world in a certain way, then that is just what our conception of knowledge is built around. And everybody's working on the same basis there. So yeah, when I say, listen, I'm listening to a caller from California, I say that to Dan. It's like, well, that's not really what's going into my ear. What's going into my ear is some electric signal that's being transformed out of these earphones into air vibration that's being taken by my ear into a brain signal that my brain is transcoding as the experience of hearing. Yeah, sure, that's true. But Dan's having the exact same experience. So when I say that I'm hearing Delon from California, he knows what I mean, and we can communicate with each other. And technically, if we wanted to be correct, we could talk about what's actually happening. But it doesn't actually matter, because the language, in the same way that our brains are taking the language of the universe and translating it into a way that we can intuitively understand, we can take the language of the process of photons being absorbed by the eyes and going up the brain and translate that into English so that we can understand what we mean. And when I say, listen, I can see this, yeah, sure, what I mean is this whole long process of how reality is interpreted by the brain, but it's fine to use the shorthand of saying that I'm seeing this, because we're both experiencing that illusion, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. I agree with you 100%. And philosophically, I think in epistemology, it's called coherentism,
which has some problems, by the way. But
yeah, it has problems, absolutely. But because we're stuck in an epistemic loop. If you were to ask, well, how do you know that you're experiencing? Because I experience it. Well, you're going through like a kind of circular logic there, but we really can't escape that, right?
Yeah.
And I've had a lot of Christian apologists use that sort of reasoning to say, well, this kind of points to God and why we should ground our, reality on a God that's more absolute, because anything other than that would be epistemic circularity. But they're stuck in it too, of course.
Yeah, exactly. So that it pulls the premise right out from under the rug, right? It's like, but everybody's version of God is different. And if you don't believe me, ask literally anybody what they think God is. You ask 10 Christians, you're going to get 11 different answers, right? It's one of those things. And there are some people who say, well, we have the true version because you have to follow X, Y, and Z. And I mean, there's certainly people who have done those things, who have tried to keep a holy life, who've tried to, read the good book and get in communication with something higher.
Right.
But,
so the question that they always throw back is, then how do you justify science? How do you justify knowing what's true through the quote unquote scientific method? And the answer to that is pretty simple. It works. And it's a shared experience. We can all experience, gravity. We can all, the logical absolutes hold up.
Sure. Well, predictions.
We can talk about that.
Predictions are a big part of it for me as well, whether something
big time, yeah.
But, I'm thinking about this like the metaphor I'm thinking of is, you ever play like Game Boy emulators? You know what I'm talking about? Like,
yeah.
Stuff. Like, I could play Pokemon on my phone, and someone could play Pokemon on their Game Boy, and we might be playing the same game, but like, there are two different experiences going on there, even though virtually they are kind of the same, but hardware-wise, they are different. And that's kind of how I think of humans almost. Like, we can kind of input certain data, even though we're obviously built different in some ways, but we can still have some virtual things that we can kind of connect to in some ways. Like virtually in the sense of data, right? Like, I can still interpret things in a similar way if I'm getting the same signals as somebody else, getting the same photons, it's bouncing around, stuff like that, right? But
here's a question I want to ask you, because a lot of there's other people, like, whether they be theists or even other people that, like, I think you mentioned the Elon Musk thing, the simulation argument. A lot of people will say, well, exactly what you're pointing out is kind of the foundation for stuff like the simulation theory. Would you say that that's kind of, you're kind of confusing epistemology with ontology in that case.
Well, so here's what I would say, and then I would want to know what Alex would say. But like just jumping to that, we're all in a simulation. Like that's a whole other thing. You know what I mean? That's a whole other premise. If we're talking specifically about simulation theory, right? Like that involves a whole other kind of way of trying to figure out what would be true about that simulation that we haven't even covered yet. It's kind of jumping the gun a little bit. Just because we can't know things perfectly or understand things doesn't mean that we're all playing The Sims. You know what I mean? So that's what I would say to that.
Conflation error.
Yeah,
like conflating.
It's a hasty generalization, I think, is the proper. I don't know if that's the proper one.
There you go.
Yeah, but. I want to hear Alex's thoughts on this for sure.
It's like, let's not throw these arguments in the same boat. The simulation argument, which, by the way, a lot of people talk about Elon Musk. I'll have you know, it was actually an Oxford philosopher who first proposed it, called Nick Bostrom. Just to
you would
represent my hometown. I'm afraid it's got to be done. You know, he doesn't get enough credit for his work, thanks to that Musk. But the argument itself, I mean, at least Bostrom's version and the version that I believe Elon Musk is kind of sympathetic to, is one that requires the belief in the existence of reality, because the argument is like, look, we're either going to become technologically advanced enough to simulate ourselves or we're not. It's likely that we will, and therefore if we did, if that simulation were perfect, then the simulation would begin to simulate, and that simulation would begin to simulate, and you'd have this endless chain of simulations. And what are the chances that we just happen to be the top one, right? But okay, the very existence of that whole construct, the very existence of the whole prismatic structure of simulation requires the existence of that real world. It requires the existence of something that actually that is real, that is tangible, that is outside of just a single brain being stimulated in a vat, right? So it's two separate arguments, because if you want to make the simulation argument, you have to first get over the hurdle of, well, does someone exist? You know, are there actual people doing actual things? Is there really a team that could simulate the universe? The first premise is like, we will become technologically advanced enough to simulate a society. Okay, who's the we there, right? If there's no reality to that, then we can't even get that off the ground. So it's a whole different argument but for some reason people seem to see it as part of the same thing. I see when you're at a pub with someone who doesn't do philosophy and they kind of throw up like, yeah, I'm really into philosophy. It's like, man, what if we like don't exist, or we're like in a simulation, or it's like, why are you putting those together? Like, right. Let's think about what we actually mean by these things. Those are totally different claims. They're both very interesting. Yes. But let's talk about them separately.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm glad that you pointed out, because Elon Musk specifically and other philosophers from the Oxford area have pointed out, like, it is a specific, it's built on specific premises that brings to specific conclusions, not just like, I guess we're just in a computer or whatever. I'm a Pikachu in some kid's Game Boy. But yeah, it's built on the idea of, who are we? What do we talk about? Is there a real, can we even make perfect simulations? A couple of different variables there.
It's a statistical argument.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, these people are taking it seriously.
Yeah.
And in that form, it's kind of very similar to the theistic, or it's like a first cause type of argument. It's like, well, we're here and there's some programmer. You could just, replace the word programmer with God, and now you've got theology. It's just, except that I think that Nick Bostrom was making a more statistical kind of argument.
Yeah, because it requires the idea that the creation will itself create. If it's just a one-level thing, if it's like a god, a single computer genius makes one society, it's like, it's not as simple as this, but you could say, what are the chances that you're one or the other? Well, the chances are kind of 50% that you're going to be at one particular level. But when it comes to the simulation argument, it's like, especially if you can run through a simulation in its entirety in less than a second, if you can kind of do it instantly, if our computing power allows it, then you have an infinite chain of degrading layers. So it's more powerful, I think, than the theistic argument, because it's based on tangible premises. I mean, the premise is not, look, the universe is finely tuned, when you can say, what do you mean by finely tuned? How do you know that it wasn't necessary? How do you know that there can be any tuning? It's like, well, the first premise is, we'll probably become advanced enough to simulate a society.
Elon
that's
Musk,
pretty reasonable. Yeah, that's not a contentious premise. And then, unlike the religious argument, again, even when you get past that first premise, the religious argument then just goes, therefore, there's probably a God. Whereas the simulation argument goes, therefore, there's probably a simulation, and that simulation probably has a simulation, and that simulation probably has a simulation, and then it becomes statistical. So it's. I don't think it's as kind of easily transmittable between theology and simulation argument. I think it's just undeniably more powerful as a syllogism. And if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, when the theist is so convinced by the fine-tuning argument, why are they not convinced by the simulation argument too?
Exactly right. Yeah. Exactly.
Here's my theory. Elon Musk.
It really becomes relatable with a Neuralink. Next year, Elon Musk is supposed to be releasing that technology.
Yeah.
Degree.
So this is my theory, right? Elon Musk is in a perpetual cycle of simulating himself until eventually, like he's the next start of the generation. So it keeps going. It's all Musk's all the way down. Right. So as soon as he figures it out, oh, this is a simulation, he begins work on the next one. And that's how it starts.
Yeah.
That's a movie right there. There you go, Hollywood.
That's what they're working on in Area 51.
That's right. I guess we'll find out in a little bit. Can't wait for that. But Delon, thank you for calling again. I do appreciate it, sir. And,
with a name suspiciously similar to Elon. I wonder what this is really about.
Yo, that's it, dude.
Didn't try very hard there, Mr. Musk.
I wish Elon Musk called into this show. That'd be really fun. But anyway, thanks again, and we'll hear from you next time.
You got it. Okay, man. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought. I almost completely forgot. Like, oh yeah, there is like a legit argument to the simulation thing that involves like statistics and current technological trends and stuff like that. That it completely slipped my mind. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of people forget that many kind of commonsensical general pub topic arguments actually have very powerful defenses. It's like the argument that, hey, we should probably give to charity. Yeah, that's a good argument, but you forget that like there are philosophers, there are like effective altruists who have really kind of nailed down the deductive argument to say, no, it's not just kind of like, hey, wouldn't it be great if everyone did this? It's like, here is proof that you have a moral obligation to do so. When someone says, maybe we don't exist, it's like, Descartes wasn't just sitting around going like, oh man, what if we just didn't exist, man? It's like, he really thought about this stuff, right? It's not just some guy in a pub. It's like, these are very, very serious arguments, and people forget that they have a very respectable tradition of philosophy.
Do you hear Alex trying to justify his degree real hard right now? He's justifying his studies. That's
all I spend my time doing. That's half my essays for my tutors are just like we have to do essays on what is theology and what is theology really different from religious studies? What's the difference? And you just feel like you're just trying to justify yourself to your own faculty. It's absolutely ridiculous.
I'm giving Alex a hard time because he's a brilliant guy and he's obviously right. There is a lot of merit to this stuff that if only the guy at the pub knew.